everyone, and welcome back to the Display Show. My name is Brian Berkeley. As a past president of SID, I'm your host for interactive discussions as we have conversations with key display industry leaders and influencers. Today's guest is Regis McKenna, who is head of Regis McKenna Incorporated. You know, for many or most of us, Regis needs no introduction at all. He is well known for his vast marketing and public relations expertise, as well as his high-profile contributions to major corporations here in Silicon Valley. Just to name a few, he helped Intel market the world's first microprocessor. He guided Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and other Apple executives through Apple's formation and growth phases, and he helped Genentech roll out their first recombinant DNA genetically engineered product. Other companies who turned to Regis for his marketing and PR expertise included Electronic Arts, Compaq, Microsoft, National Semiconductor, Spectraphysics, Silicon Graphics, 3Com, and a host of others. Among various companies he advises today, he is board member of Nanosys, who is sponsoring these talks. Regis has received many awards, and it is safe to say that he is a major part of Silicon Valley folklore. Regis, thanks so much for being here with us today.
You're welcome, Brian.
You know, it's hard to know where to begin. Maybe we should start with General Micro. Can you tell us about them?
Yeah, General Micro was sort of my introduction to technology in any kind of depth. I was actually working for a small ad agency. I had moved here from the East Coast in 1963 and was working for a small ad agency and got an account called General Microelectronics, GME. And they were one of the early spin-offs of Fairchild with the intention of building MOS, that's metal on oxide, on silicon. And you know, that hadn't been done yet, but it was a key breakthrough in probably what has allowed us to create the kind of processors and memory technology that we allow today. That's an underlying technology. You know, in effect, you were able to put down transistors, many more transistors, without having to insulate every layer. You got faster speed, you got low power. It offered all the benefits. And the military loved it for making lighter weight instruments, particularly for rockets. And so GME was was a relatively small company, but they not only grew the ingots and polished them and did all the surfacing, and then did the masking and the deposition and the screening. So you could walk from one end of the building to the other and see, you know, molten silicon, and you could see actually finished products coming out the other end. And then they got a contract to build in 1965 to build a calculator for Monroe Calculator Company. It was called the 3900 because it took hundreds and hundreds of mechanical and electromechanical components. It was able to reduce them to 39 chips, single chips, and those were basically MOS chips, and it was successful for a very short period of time. And the reason being that the processes were not very stable at that time. The yields were terrible. And so, you know, they sort of shipped money with every shipment. But it showed what was possible using this technology. And later on, the Apple II actually looked and felt exactly like the Monroe Calculator, the 3900 Monroe Calculator. And not only that, but the ads that were done for the calculator and for GME were 6-color. They were the same 6 colors that were used in the Apple logo 10 years later.
You know, last week when we spoke, you showed me a couple of those props, the General Micro transistors. I wonder if you happen to have those nearby or handy. Because you know what's funny? When you showed me those, I remembered building breadboards, prototypes using single transistors. You almost have to identify them.
Yeah, I don't know if you can actually even see it here because it's so, it's so small. But I don't know. Can you see that at all?
I can. If you, yeah, there you go. There it is in the upper right.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
It's an epoxy transistor, you know, circa 63, 65. And that was really the first marketing project I had, because before they could develop the devices, the MOS devices, they were selling transistors. And as the integrated circuit came along and replaced the transistors, they were still making these transistors by the millions, tens of millions. And so there was an excess amount of them. And one of the things GME did, we started getting orders from Hong Kong for bunny eyes. And the bunny eyes, if you notice, there's two little leads, copper leads coming out the bottom, and actually three. And they would stick it in the bunny and bend the leads so that they made eyes. I'm sure it didn't pass OSHA, but at that time, you know, 50 years ago, it did. So bunny eyes was a big profitable item on our sales forecast.
Well, you never know how the applications will roll out.
Right.
That's an interesting one. After General Magic, you joined up with National at an early stage. So,
yeah, I was General Micro was bought by Philco Ford back in Philadelphia, and they were moving everything back there. So I got a call from Don Valentine, who had just become director of marketing at National Semiconductor, and literally it was right across the street from GME. So I literally walked out the door and across the street for my interview. And Don and Charlie Spork, who was really the founder of National, were there, and there was no furniture in the building, literally nothing. They were pitching pennies against the wall, and you could hear them echo. And so you know, I had gotten to know a lot of people at National or at GME. And of course, GME came from Fairchild, so did National. So all these people knew each other. So the reference base was very strong for me. And that would later on also help me in terms of getting Intel.
Well, and I know that was a really big move for you, and that came next. So I'm very interested to know, and I'm sure the viewers will be interested to know how you got involved with Intel. And talk to us about marketing at the company and the world's first microprocessor.
Yeah, the way it happened, I guess, was National really. Don Valentine was a terrific teacher, and in terms of learning marketing, and he basically said to me, you know, I don't want to see you behind your desk. I want to see you out on the road all the time, which I was. So for the position that I held, I spent probably 80% of my time traveling, seeing customers, seeing application seeing applications in practice, you know, seeing distributors, going with sales guys on calls, all those kinds of things. And so, you know, I had a fair amount of experience by the time I was there. That would be my second semiconductor company. So, and both of those had split out from Fairchild. Intel, I basically had set out to get them. And I had a fellow who worked for me who had worked for Bob Noyce at Fairchild. He was doing research for me. And I asked him if he would call Bob and set up a meeting, which he did. And well, actually, they called him first, asking him to do, believe it or not, plant location work, because that's what he used to do for Noyce, was plant location work. And so he told me that Bob had called him and asked him if he would do some, and he turned him down because he said he was now doing work for me. And I said, you call him back and you tell him that you'll do it, but you'll do it on one condition, and that is that he has dinner with me. And so we set up a dinner with Bob Noyce, Ed Gelbach, who was VP of Marketing, and myself and this Don Coburn. And we met at a restaurant, and I made a presentation to them. about what I had been doing and what that meant. Now, Noyce, I think, he was really a visionary, and he saw things being done with the microprocessor that most people didn't back, when it was just still struggling to find applications. And so I think he saw that I had worked with a lot of people he knew. And in fact, Charlie Spork almost went to work for him at Intel. So did a number of people that eventually went to National. And certainly at GME, were mostly research guys. They all came out of Fairchild Research, who also worked for Bob. So they all knew each other. And so I had this great reference base of people that I'd worked for the last 5-6 years. And they were all, gave me good testimonials. And, Noyce called me the next morning and said, we'd like you to do, our advertising and PR and what marketing projects we have. They really didn't do much marketing then. They didn't call it marketing. It was product marketing. But at National, I also was product marketing manager for two product lines. So I had experience in that as well.
So interesting to look at the Valley, and in many ways, there were so many connections back then, and there still are now, where you think of Silicon Valley as being giant, but actually the relationships are important, and you're never that far away from being connected to key people throughout the industry.
The thing is that the thing with Intel was that we say the first microprocessor, but it really didn't make any bells or whistles out there. Nobody knew what a microprocessor was or what it was for or how you use it. It really was, sort of an infant without a mother or father. It had a long history in technology and in theory, but it really didn't in terms of practice. And so people, if you think about it, what changed was engineers used to design a product by breadboarding it first. They'd take a circuit card. They'd lay all the devices down on it, whether resistors, transistors, capacitors, and so forth. And then they built a schematic, and then they built the board out of that. And then every engineer had technicians that worked for them on the bench, and they would design this and then test the board and then do little wraparounds of copper wires on the back. And so it was a very complex process of getting a product to market. That was all done away with. You didn't need to do any component picking anymore. With the microprocessor, it was microprogramming. So you actually programmed it with software. It wasn't done through hardware. It was done in these development tools that Intel also came out with. The Intellect was the first one. And so those development tools enable engineers to sit down and put their program in, microprogram it. And so what needed to be done was an explanation of more training and education of how to apply a microprocessor, put it to use, what kind of applications. So while the 4004, which was the 4-bit microprocessor, came out in 1971, it wasn't until 1983 that it took off in terms of the 8-bit and the 16-bit, when the IBM personal computer adopted the 8085 actually processor as its processing power. So that really took the market, then grew. But up until that time, we spent 10 years trying to figure out where the market was, how to sell the product, and obviously knowing that we had to move up the technology train in terms of 4-bit, 8-bit, 16-bit, 32-bit, so forth. So that was the 10 years. That was part of the 10 years, because Intel also made EEPROMs. They made RAM memory. They made all kinds of other products. Intel was the most prolific technology company in terms of new products I've ever seen or worked with in my life. I'll bet we did 50 to 100 projects a month. It was,
Wow.
it was really, I mean, they were all over by the, you know, and then we started doing their work for Portland. We started doing their work for Europe. So combining that up, they became a huge global client for us.
That's a lot of products, and that will keep any marketer completely busy. Tell us about the Intel Crush campaign.
Well, Intel was a bit, probably some hubris took over in terms of their technical snobbery and leadership. Because by 1979, the microprocessor, Motorola was a competitor, and Motorola's 68,000 had come out. And that was a much better processor for designing, actually. I think the architecture of the 68,000 was completely different than the 8086. And so many of the new applications were using the 68,000 model. And so Intel began losing market share rapidly, I mean, very rapidly, as these things got into production. And this was in '69. Nobody seemed to really concerned about it, but there was a sales guy back in Boston who sent a letter to Grove telling him what was going on. Literally, that if they didn't turn this around, we were going to be out of the microprocessor business. And so Grove got everybody together, formed a task force of, I think it was about 9 or 10 people. It was product marketing managers. It was Bill Campbell. Bill Campbell, no, it was before him. It was Bill Davidow. Bill Davidow was the VP of marketing. Dave House was ran the marketing for the processors and for memories. So we had enough key executives there, but most of it was just people from different departments of Intel. And we went to Ricky's, locked ourselves up for a week, because the task was to come up with a strategy to beat Motorola, and that's what we did for a week. But we looked at every aspect of the company. We looked at sales, marketing, distribution, engineering, new product development, management. So everybody in the company was engaged in this, from actually regularly presentations to the board, regular presentations to the executive staff. Every Wednesday, we had a meeting with the executive staff to make a presentation on what progress we have made. Those meetings were then you made commitments for the following month, and then you had to come back the following month and either justify why you didn't do it or give a new set of goals. And it was very disciplined and very concentrated. We brought everybody together that was key manager in the company here for a conference, sat them down, divvied up tasks, and everybody was off that following week getting things done. But it was a big corporate-wide concerted effort, and allocating money, and a lot of it was really done at the sales level, getting the right kind of tools for the sales guys to get design wins. And that was the whole thing. How many design wins? So we started tracing design wins across the spectrum of companies. And when we had the majority of the design wins is whenever we said, okay, we're winning. But it wasn't before that.
Well, Intel's had a lot of marketing. I think everybody has heard of the Intel Inside campaign. I wonder if you feel that that's an example of good marketing.
Well, I have a problem with that. I didn't think so, quite frankly. It's not something I did. We did do Intel's advertising up until I sold my business, my ad business, in 1981 to Jay Chiat. And Jay Chiat picked up both Intel and Apple. He still has Apple today, or that agency. But in any event, Intel didn't increase their market share any, if that was the goal. Intel owned 85% of the the microprocessor market simply because they were designed into the IBM PC, and the PC owned 80% of the market. And so Intel's share of that marketplace went with the PC. And so it didn't increase market share. What it was intended to do was to support the retailers. Now, what I felt it did, though, is it commoditized the processor market. It brought prices down drastically, because if you went into a computer store and looked at all the PCs on the shelf, every one of them said Intel inside. So there was really no differentiation between any of those products. The only one that was selling distinctively was Apple, because it didn't have Intel. So I thought we ought to put in on Intel not inside.
Well, Apple is something that you and I have in common, actually. Yeah. I worked at Apple for 20 years, including running the display activity at Apple. And a lot of folks watching this are interested in displays. Now, you had worked with Apple from the very, very early days, starting in 1976, before the company was even incorporated, let alone public. And I guess I'd like to know, and I am sure that others would like to know, how you met Steve Jobs, and if you could relate a story or two about those startup days at Apple.
Yeah, well, it's sort of easy. Steve called Intel. Steve was he was born and raised in Mountain View, and so he lived in this area. He knew all the high tech companies. His neighbors were all worked in these high tech companies, so he was very familiar. Even by the time he was a teenager in high school, he was and belonging to the computer club. He knew what was going on, and so he basically called Intel and asked who was doing their marketing work, and they referred him to me. Steve, we were up to our eyeballs in business at that time, and so we screened our clients pretty carefully. We got criticized highly for doing that, but quite frankly, all you have is your talent, and hiring good talent fast enough, we just couldn't do. After all, Palo Alto is not the mecca of advertising and PR. And so getting good people to move here was difficult. And so what happened was Steve came, and I finally agreed to see him and Woz. They had an article they wanted published in Byte magazine. And I knew the publisher of Byte magazine, and I always had arguments with him over the fact that it was engineers talking to engineers and not engineers talking to consumers. And if they really wanted to get their product in that world moving, they had to reach into the consumer world. And so I told Wozniak that I'd have to rewrite his article so that it made sense. And he didn't like that at all. He got really kind of pissed off at me. And so I just threw my hands up and said, if you think we're going to do a one-shot something, you're crazy. I mean, it's just, you're not going to succeed by running an article in a magazine, and trying to sell your product. The article was on the Apple II, and they hadn't even completed the design yet. And so, so I told them they could go. So they left. But Steve called me back, and Steve will call you back 1,000 times if you don't return. Yeah, right. Yeah, if you don't return his call. And so he and I spent some time, just he and I together, and we got along really, really well. The whole idea of trying to build a long-range strategic program that involved, again, everything in the company, and not just simply, run some ads or run an article, but to build a whole kind of philosophy and culture around, the Apple business, and that's what we talked about, and that's what, by and large, we did, was to build sort of this. I want to say mythological, but it was it had the perfect story, you know, two dropouts. This was a time whenever most American consumer electronic companies had gone out of business due to foreign competition. You know, the Japanese and the Taiwanese and so forth had really taken over the tape recorder, the game machine market, all the kinds of things that come out. Boom, it was gone almost immediately. Well, what happened was that Apple became a bright spot. I mean, having a computer in a home, nobody knew quite what that meant at the time, but they knew it sounded good, and everybody probably say, "Wow, I'd like to have one of those." And that was our intent, and that's why we did a different kind of logo. Was because the tradition. You know, I looked at IBM's logo and I looked at all the other computer companies' logos. They were black and white. They looked like a piece of rock stone, you know, and I think they wanted it to be like that. But in fact, this was a new generation. This was these people really came out of the hippie psychedelic world, and so the Apple really took on those psychedelic colors. And the illustrator was a guy named Tom Kamafuji, who did a lot of posters and won a lot of awards on his art in psychedelic art. And so he was the guy who actually stripped in the colors into the logo, and I think that's made it. And it certainly made it different.
Hey, I brought a prop for you here.
Did you?
Yeah, I don't know if you can see this.
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah, here we go.
There it is.
That's my business card from. This is an old business card because they changed the logo, but I thought you'd be amused at least to see that logo, and that was created right there in your house, right? Isn't that?
It was, you know, it was created at my company. There was a guy named what was his name? Forget his name now. But I had a bunch of designers that worked for me, and you know, they worked on it, and but I sold it to Steve on my kitchen table. Yeah, in this house. Yeah.
Okay, so this logo, you convinced Steve to use it in the next room over at your place then.
Yeah, and he was over here all the time. He'd come over here on his Harley all the time. He knows all my kids. He knew all my kids. He knew our family. You know, they kind of grew up with him, and they even went to the same high school he went to, and so forth. So, Steve and Woz, in fact, Woz's parents we knew quite well. They lived in our neighborhood, and so. The only thing that Steve wanted to do was to make sure that if we printed it on metal, you could get the registration, because you had to run it through the printing press several times. You know, printing presses couldn't handle the number of colors necessary. They do black or white, or then they do, the primary colors, but they don't, then they blend them. But to get those number of colors and to get the registration right so that they don't overlap in any way, that meant we had to go out and get some samples, which we did. We had printed on metal for him, and that did it. Rob Janoff is the guy who actually designed the logo.
Steve Jobs really cared about the look and appearance of logos, fonts. There's a story about how he called Google up because there was a slight, I think it was the yellow wasn't quite right. And he actually called them up to say, look, you've got to get this fixed. He just had a passion for it. I can tell you that on the first Macintosh project, which I was fortunate to work on, he cared so much about the font appearance and every aspect of the industrial design of the product. Now, back in 1985, this is a couple years after the very first Mac had shipped, or maybe a year and a half after, because we shipped in January of 84. Right. I had suggested to Steve that we put color onto the Macintosh. And he didn't like the idea at the time. He felt that color looked bad on those displays back in the mid-'80s. And he also remarked that color couldn't be printed. So I'm wondering if you and Steve ever had disagreements.
You know, I've said it, and when I read your question that you had sent me, I racked my brain, but I can't come up with a time when Steve and I had any serious shouting match or any kind of serious disagreement. No, never. And I knew him from the time he was 19 till he was, till he died. And he would call me regularly on weekends. I knew him. I think I knew him fairly well. He would actually call and talk to my wife first because they would talk about their families, so he knew us well. We knew him well.
He was definitely a strong-minded leader with courage of convictions, and
Yeah.
I wonder, Regis, how you went about influencing him.
I think the sort of one of the things that I would constantly do is to try to get feedback from the field, feedback from customers, feedback from dealers, distributors, and so forth. And so I actually spent time, selling Macs behind the store counter one day, for a couple of days, learning what the experience is like and talking to people. And so I think it comes from really spending time with him. If you approached Steve in the right way, and without a large argument, but in suggestions, and you kept it up, and you had rationale and reasonable argument for it, he would soon adopt it as his own. So, as you probably know,
yes, sir.
right? I mean, and it becomes ours, not yours, not mine, and that's fine. I mean, I thought that was just wonderful if I could convince him. I also got him involved with other people. Steve and I traveled a lot together. We visited New York on numerous occasions. Always stayed at the St. Regis, because there's a Maxwell Parrish piece of art there that he admired, and later on, I think, bought some of Maxwell Parrish's work. So Steve was an art aficionado. He loved music. When he bought his first house here up in Los Altos Hills, the only thing he had in the house was a piano. It was a baby grand piano that he had in the living room, and he would invite people he knew who played the piano to come and play. And so you could sit on the floor and have a vegetarian dinner and play the piano.
He had a piano over in the original Mac building also.
Right.
I still remember the address, 10460 Banley. It's Banley 3. Yeah. And we had it wasn't just a piano, it was a Bosendorfer, beautiful instrument.
No, he could recite both the Beatles songs almost by heart, every song, and certainly Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan was a saint to him, and so he would just, in a meeting or whatever, he would always say, Bob Dylan has a song, and in the song it says, and he would recite the line. And he's done that with the Beatles as well. He loved that music.
Yes. Hey, I have a question for you. I wonder if you happen to be wearing your Apple Watch.
Yes, I do.
Okay.
So we've gone
you've
from
got it on.
My first marketing project was this, right? And while I didn't do any marketing on it, this Apple Watch has 5 billion transistors in it.
That billion with a B. That is quite the step up from the compute power that was in the Apple II or even the original Macintosh.
Oh yeah, the first microprocessor had less than 2,000 transistors on it, maybe 1,500.
So now you have a device with 5 billion. Think about the computing power on your wrist then.
Yeah. And in fact, they can use that processor. They're using the same processor now in most of their devices. But what is fascinating about that is when you think about the improvements in technology, the ability to do, let's say, dynamic interaction or user interaction or real-time interaction or color, for that matter. that's managed by your device, that really depends upon the power of the processor and the storage. And so you can't just do one thing without a whole array of technologies flowing into place. So once all the sort of underlying technologies, like particularly the ability to create different kinds of transistors, they make 3D transistors now. You know, they put them on sides of the material, and so it creates a much denser device without having to increase the power or change or in fact increase the performance too, because they're closer together and the speed is much faster.
Well, as a good example of that, I know the guys who developed the low temperature polyoxide display that is used on the more recent Apple Watches. I think they started using it from version 4. That's an amazing screen, and it's an example of the many technologies that flow in to make a great product. Those LTPO screens enable power savings that in turn enables the smaller form factor of the device and a lot better battery life. So it's wonderful to see the technology continue to improve. And I guess I'm wondering if you'd like to share, you have so much experience with Apple. You even came back when there was AntennaGate. I know that. Would you like to share any other anecdotes about Apple or any other company for that matter?
Well, you know, it's a miracle that Apple is there at all. I mean, it should have collapsed many times over the years.
Oh, we almost did. I was there in 1995, 1996, and a lot of people don't recognize how close we came to having to shut the whole operation down. It was really tough times.
Well, you know, I knew the follow-on presidents after Steve left. I knew them all very well. You know, I think they were just the wrong choices, and so I think that starting sort of at the high level down from almost the board down, I think there were some bad decisions made at Apple. But you know, when Steve came back, he wasn't sure that he could save it either. And in fact, you know, I have a phone call from him. I think it was early in the summer of '98. And he said he went over, you know, he had sold Next to Apple, largely because the Apple was looking for the operating system. And so he thought that would give him entree back into Apple. And you know, incidentally, just to digress a second, when Steve left Apple, I tried to convince him to go back or to stay or to put off Next for a year so he wouldn't be sued, and had long conversations with him and the attorneys and everybody at that time. Steve said, you know, I might be able to be a benefit to Apple where one day I might have a product that I would sell them that they could put to use. That was when he started. That was just before he had even started Next.
That happened. That absolutely happened.
So, you know, his getting back into Apple, but apparently he said, you know, he said they got more PR people in there than engineers. They've got, you know, nobody seems to understand software. And he just went on and on and on complaining to me about, you know, all the things there. And that the most important thing, I think, was that they didn't even offer him an advisory role or any kind of position there to help pull, you know, help integrate the product. And he was willing to do that. And then, you know, we didn't talk for a while. And about 3 months later, I got a phone call from him. And he said, how do you like my new board? And he meant new board of directors. Because in the meantime, he had not only gotten in, taken over, but he created a whole new board of directors. And, you know, how he would do that he had no investment in the company. He had no major stake in the company. He owned no shares in the company at the time. and yet he was able to come in, take it over, and to turn it around basically. Though he was always unsure, or wasn't always, but he was unsure for that first probably year whether or not it would be successful.
I can tell you that we absolutely would not have survived if he had not come back to the company. There's no way.
Well, he had a way of really just pointing at the most obvious, important thing to do and do it, and then driving people to do it, to step beyond what they thought they could do.
And what he said when he came back was that he felt that the world would be a better place with Apple in it. And that drove him to revive the company that he had co-founded.
Yeah, and he was right. I mean, it's the one company that combines, sort of artistry with engineering. And so Sony had been on that track, I think, but they got too rigid in their format. And I once talked to Steve about it, about Apple becoming the digital Sony. I also knew the people at Sony quite well. They were clients of ours as well, Sony R&D.
I was fortunate to meet Akio Morita.
I knew Morita.
Yeah, at Japan Airlines Flight 1, and we talked, and because at that point I had integrated the Trinitron into Apple's Macintosh II, and that's what enabled us to make good-looking color on the Mac.
Sure. I mean, and in fact, there was a point at which I met with Sony. Morita had left. It was the next guy. What was his name? Next president of Sony. Anyway, I met with him, and they were trying to figure out that they wanted to build an alliance, and they didn't know whether to do it in terms of with Microsoft or with Apple. And it just made sense to me to tell them they should make an alliance with Apple. And I'm just surprised that Sony didn't jump at Apple before Steve came back, or other companies. There were other companies in the periphery all looking at it, but they couldn't get a definitive sort of picture of what it might be. And I think that's where Steve also added so much value to Apple, was this is what we could be. And then proceeded to set in a plan to do that.
Steve admired Steve admired Sony for the way they marketed products, but he also loved the products. He'd talk about the Walkman and how significant that was. And I think that helped him to think ahead toward eventually creating the iPod.
Yeah, when he and I used to go to New York, we'd always go in the Sony store and walk around and look at all the stuff. Yeah. So
marketing is important. I'd like you to tell us a little bit about marketing and how it differs from more common advertising, and just general thoughts.
My general thoughts on advertising is that first of all, it's overrated. There's so much noise level out there today. And people really do, vote negative on commercials and things that interrupt their lives. So I've always been, I didn't come out of an advertising world. I came out of, basically a general purpose world, and so the learning about advertising from the ground up was what I had to do. And what I found out was that, or what I really learned was that the whole concept of PR, or getting journalists and editors to write stories about you, had a degree of credibility attached to it that your ads are never achieve. It's like I used to have a foil that would quote little kid I heard say, "Oh, you can't believe that. It's just an ad," and so and then there's the ad won all the awards, but the company went bankrupt. That was Apple with the 1984 ad. They ran this very expensive ad. They ran it one time, and and over the next 5 years, Apple went into a steep decline. So, you've got to sort of tie this together and look at what really counts in terms of marketing. And to me, marketing is a culture. It's not a thing you do. And it's actually just like quality is part of everybody's job. Everybody in the company can be, part of the marketing process by how they speak about what they do, how they do their own individual job, from chairman of the board down to the shipping clerk. You can do your job in a perfect way. And I think that the one company that eventually came to harvest that idea and to put it into practice was Apple. Very few have done it since then. It's harder to do in a company with commercial products, with consumer products, I think, because there's just so many different facets to it, and so many different places in which the customer and the company touch each other. Not only from service and repair, but updating products every 3 weeks or 2 weeks now, whatever it is. All of that is touching the customer, and each of those kind of have opportunities for enhancing the relationship, or for screwing it up. And I think that I think Apple's the one company that goes beyond the norm on that.
What do you feel is the biggest issue in high-tech marketing today?
Well, the biggest issue that we see arising right now, and it's largely because of the online media, is trust. We don't know what to trust anymore, and of course, artificial intelligence, virtual reality, all of these kinds of things are coming in now, and certainly, let alone with Photoshop. I mean, you can alter things. So people are now skeptical about what they see and hear and even read, simply because of the nature of being able to manipulate media so easily, and anyone can do it. I mean, they see mostly kids in grammar school are able to get in and manipulate media, as well as certainly the senior people who do it on purpose. So I think that trust is a huge, and without trust, you don't have a brand, because it's what people keep coming back to because they trust it, and so I think that's a serious issue coming up
in this era of 24/7 news cycle, and misinformation and deep fakes. This is a huge issue for sure.
Yeah, I mean, somebody like Apple gets linked in with, every time the media talks about, Google or Microsoft every time they talk about Facebook or LinkedIn or one of those media companies, they refer to it as a Silicon Valley company. And they also refer to everything that happens here as happening in Silicon Valley. So everybody's included in an umbrella. They use it as a collective noun, and it's not. There are thousands of companies in Silicon Valley, only a few of which are really big companies. In fact, there's about 25 to 30 companies over 50 billion, and that's fairly small.
I'm going to talk a little bit about displays, because people watch. This is the display show. Many people watching are going to want to know your perspectives on displays. What do you think about displays as critical enablers of products?
Well, they're part of this total marketing process, right? I mean, when I say marketing, I wrote an article for Harvard Business Review back in '98 called "Marketing is Everything," and that fits the bill, because, quite frankly, you can have great information, but if it's not conveyed in an interesting, inviting way, if you can't really decipher the details of a product or an action on a screen, if it doesn't sort of arise some emotion in you, and color arises motion, we know that through many years of you know psychological investigation, color does emit emotion. And so the use of it, I think, it becomes vitally important in conveying to your customers and to the consumers in general. You know, to inviting them in a friendly way to be trusting. And so, yeah, I think color is extremely important, extremely important one. I'm also an amateur photographer, by the way. So, and I travel around the world doing animals and things. So I do a lot of color photography.
Well, then let's talk about color and let's talk about Nanosys itself. You're on the board of Nanosys. And so when you joined up with the company, it was working on many different applications for line dots. And you had been one of the people to encourage Nanosys to focus on displays. So I think you just touched on these, but maybe you can go a little bit into more depth on your reasons for giving that direction.
Yeah, the reason is if you when nanotechnology came out, everybody sort of threw money at it. A lot of the venture people threw money at nanotech, but they really didn't know what it meant. You know, there's a lot of discussions about you know, how big is a nano, and how do you compare it to other types of things like DNA and so forth. It's 175,000 times smaller a nano than the width of a human hair, that I remember. And so, you know, these are very small devices. Excuse me. So when it first came out, but it's also can be used in so many different applications. It's used now in medical applications. It's used in industry. It's used. I mean, you know, you can use nanotechnology or various forms of nanotechnology. They all vary by application, but there's hundreds of applications. There's thousands, perhaps, of the application of various forms of nanotechnology or nano devices, and displays was one of them. But and Nanosys was fooling around with all different kinds of industries. I mean, they were talking to the military, they were talking to medical groups, they were talking, and so they had little projects in you know in a lot of different things, but weren't able to focus on any one of them. And we decided to sit down and spend a day doing nothing but talking about what really should be the focus. And I started with the marketplace, talking about you know, all this information we're gathering. We're gathering more information now than I don't know if you've ever heard of Buckminster Fuller's knowledge doubling curve. But you know, his knowledge doubling curve, you know, we're now doubling the total amount of information in the world. It used to happen every 50 years before World War II. After World War II, it was doubling every 25 years. By the 1980s, it was doubling every 10 years. Now it's down, and I heard recently that they were talking about studies at IBM and some of the other computer companies that the knowledge doubling curve is happening every 12 hours. And so we double the amount of knowledge, total amount of knowledge that's out there. So deciphering that knowledge, putting it to effective and actually profitable use requires some discipline and focus. And so, you know, and I've always used that sort of Buckminster Fuller's curve to talk about how even in a company, you can't really manage so many product lines, particularly when you're a startup. And so much of this at that time, that remember, this was 15 years ago. Yeah, almost maybe 15, 16 years ago when they started. And they were a relatively small company. So much of nanotechnology itself was still in the research phase of development, not development even, you know. And so there was still a fair amount of that being done because they didn't understand they didn't actually understand the the nature of the particles that they were dealing with. And you learn that as as one professor at Stanford told me, technology is business you learn by doing. It's not something you sit back and study. You learn it by hands-on. And so over 15 years of working with nano devices, Nanosys was really time that I felt that they look at focusing that energy. If you look at where is all this information heading, it's going to be heading for somebody's screen. Right? I mean, these are the windows to the world now. This is where we get our services. This is where I do my doctor. We do, online conversations. I do all my, your bills. You do your, you look stuff up on services that you need. You order stuff from around the world. You do, everything you sort of encounter or do, you need to screen to do that. And so, the intelligible information that comes through either this screen or a big screen, I've got giant screen in the other room, that sort of thing. They're all necessary for us to live in today's world. And I think that what Nanosys needed at that time was to get rid of all these little projects, just a little bit like Steve did later on when he went into Apple and said, hey, we don't have to be doing all these things. They were doing a lot of duplicate projects and what they called Swiss Navy projects and so forth. And you don't need to do those. You could focus on simply displays and because everything has got to go through. And nanotechnology fit well with displays. It's progressing and evolving to actually perform better and better every year. Every year it gets better.
I do want to know if you have any tips for display makers or marketers bringing these new, more immersive displays to market. Is this all about having a great demo, or how can we tell stories that connect with consumers?
Yeah, I got to tell you that I think that by and large, you can do things that connect it, but it never, the color never reproduces as well when you try to promote it through paper. It really does need the display itself to sell itself. And I think that this is where people really can see the difference for yourself. And while people may buy things online, they generally go to the store and look at them first. I know people do that with TVs. I know that they'll go and look at the TV in line, and then they may buy it somewhere else, or they may buy it online. But in fact, they look at the different devices in person. And I think that I do think that more and more demos, and so finding a way to put demos in different places like airports and large meeting places and so forth, I think becomes really important. And it's sort of like Starbucks, that people use Starbucks not because the coffee's that great. It's just that it's there. You can't step 20 feet without stepping into it. There, I heard last week that there's a Starbucks starting up inside another Starbucks. That sort of thing. They're everywhere, and that was their intention. And I think that's really happening now. One of the growth factors for the iPhone was the fact that it just showed up everywhere, and people, every customer that used it demoed it. I'll bet there's 2 to 5 sales for every iPhone that they sell, just from reference from the people that use them. And so we go back to one of these old-fashioned, trusting relationships. Is when you first wanted to buy a personal computer, you asked somebody, what personal computer should I buy? Because you didn't trust yourself to make that judgment. So now, how do you trust someone else? Well, you use references, and those references have to be credible, and those references have to actually stand up over time and in terms of quality and sustainability. So I think that displays, they just have to get themselves into the right places and start giving the messages through their own technologies about the quality of what they're producing.
You said something really important, which is the displays are better than paper. And I think that's right, because paper is a reflective display, and it's only as good as the quality of the aluminum that's being in the first place. What do you think about the potential of small companies like Nanosys to disrupt the market today?
Well, I think the potential for small companies to disrupt the market in almost anywhere is there, because they're doing it. The venture capital business is still booming here. And so small companies are actually disrupting things. I can tell you, I won't mention their names, but they're other fields, but certainly it's happening in the medical field. It's happening in the, particularly in real-time computing and real-time and analytical computing and AI. We're seeing lots of new innovations in that area. And it seems to me that in the last 10 years, we've seen a half a dozen different platforms show up, so that the whole computer industry itself is sort of a Rubik's Cube of new platforms that you sort of all put together and create a sort of a closed loop system with your consumer, where real-time analysis of the consumer's want and need back into your system, and then the feedback. So it seems to me that, we're still proving that the small company can make an important statement.
I want to thank you so much for this valuable time today. Being able to meet with you and speak with you, you're a legend. And so
don't tell my kids that.
Oh, but it's true. And I'm just so grateful, and I'm sure our audience is grateful for your willingness to share time and to be with us. Thank you so much for everything that you've done for the industry, for Apple, for all of Silicon Valley, and for small companies like Nanosys. It's been a real pleasure to have it.
Great to have this chat. Take care.
Thank you so much.